The bathtub held a secret. On March 1st of 2015, when paramedics pulled a woman's lifeless body from the cooling water, they had no idea they were looking at a murder scene. The husband's story seemed plausible, a tragic accident, a wife who'd drowned while bathing, but one phone call made earlier that morning would unravel everything. And it would take a detective 3 years to prove what everyone suspected. Some accidents are too convenient to be real. The Denver suburb of Park Hill on that early March afternoon appeared picture-perfect. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, families living the comfortable upper-middle-class dream. At 5832 South Monaco Parkway, the Feldman residence stood as a testament to success, a beautiful colonial home where Robert and Stacy Feldman were raising their 2 young children in what neighbors described as an ideal family setting. But inside that home, something terrible had happened, and the truth was buried under layers of deception that would take years to excavate. When the 911 call came in at 4:02 p.m., the dispatcher heard urgency in Robert Feldman's voice. His wife was in the bathtub, not breathing. He needed help immediately. Within minutes, Denver Fire Department paramedics arrived at the scene, rushing through the front door with equipment designed to save lives. They were already too late. Stacy Feldman, just 44 years old, lay on the bathroom floor where her husband said he'd pulled her from the tub. Her body was cold. Rigor mortis had begun. The paramedics exchanged glances. This woman had been dead for hours, not minutes. But Robert Feldman stood nearby, appearing distraught, explaining that he'd just arrived home with their children after a full day out. He'd found her like this, he said. He'd tried CPR. He'd done everything he could. The first responders couldn't have known it then, but they were witnessing the final act of an elaborate performance, one that had been carefully staged to conceal murder. To understand what happened in that house on March 1st, you have to rewind 12 hours earlier to the beginning of what should have been an ordinary Sunday morning in the Feldman household. Stacy Feldman woke that morning with plans. It was Purim, the Jewish holiday celebrating the salvation of the Jewish people from persecution, and the family had festivities to attend. She had volunteered at her children's Hebrew school, was active in the local Jewish community, and had a dinner scheduled with friends that evening. She was healthy, energetic, and by all accounts looking forward to the day ahead. Robert Feldman later told investigators that he and Stacy had breakfast together, discussed their schedules, and everything seemed normal. Around 8:30 a.m., he said, he gathered up their 2 children, ages 9 and 6 at the time, and headed out for the day. First stop was Temple Micah for Purim services, then a carnival at the synagogue, followed by a basketball game, and finally a park. It was a full itinerary, the kind of busy Sunday that defined suburban family life. Robert told police he wouldn't return home until around 3:00 p.m., expecting to find his wife preparing for their evening plans. But this timeline, so detailed, so specific, so carefully constructed, would become the first crack in Robert Feldman's story. Because while Robert was supposedly gone, Stacy received a phone call that would seal her fate. Her name remains protected in court documents, identified only as a woman Robert was having a relationship with. For the purposes of understanding this case, we'll call her Susan, though that's not her real name. Susan would become the prosecution's star witness, the person whose actions on that Sunday morning would ultimately lead to justice for Stacy Feldman. Susan had met Robert Feldman online, through one of several dating apps and websites he frequented. They'd been seeing each other for approximately 6 weeks, meeting for intimate encounters at hotels and other locations around Denver. Robert had told Susan what men have told their mistresses since time immemorial. His marriage was essentially over. He and his wife were living separate lives. Divorce papers were being prepared. It was just a matter of time before he was officially single. Susan believed him. Why wouldn't she? Robert was charming, attentive, successful. He worked in business, drove a nice car, presented himself as a man transitioning from one chapter of life to another. The chemistry between them was real, or so Susan thought. But on the morning of March 1st, 2015, something gnawed at Susan's conscience. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was a detail that didn't quite line up. Maybe it was simply the need to know the truth. Whatever the reason, Susan made a decision that would change multiple lives forever. She went online and searched for information about Robert Feldman's wife. What she found shocked her. There was no divorce, no separation. Robert Feldman was very much married, and his wife appeared to be very much present in his life. The family photos, the social media posts, the complete lack of any indication that this marriage was ending, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Robert had been lying to her about everything. Susan picked up her phone. Her hands trembled as she searched for Stacy Feldman's phone number. At approximately 8:52 a.m., she made the call that would set a murder in motion. Stacy answered, and for the next several minutes, Susan told her everything. What happened in that phone call would be reconstructed later through Susan's testimony. She told Stacy about the affair, about the meetings, about Robert's lies regarding his marriage. According to Susan, Stacy's response was measured almost eerily calm. She asked a few questions. How long had this been going on? Where had they met? Was Susan aware that Robert had a family? Stacy thanked Susan for calling. She said she needed to think about what to do next. The conversation lasted approximately 10 minutes. When it ended, Stacy knew her husband had betrayed her, and according to prosecutors, that knowledge cost her her life. Here's what investigators believe happened in the hours that followed. A reconstruction built from evidence, phone records, witness statements, and forensic analysis. Robert returned home sometime between 9 and 10 a.m., much earlier than he later claimed. Whether he came back to check on something, had forgotten an item, or had planned to return all along remains unclear. What is clear is that he walked into a confrontation he hadn't anticipated. Stacy, armed with the truth Susan had provided, confronted her husband about the affair. Imagine the scene. A wife who has just discovered her husband's infidelity, her trust shattered, her family's future suddenly uncertain, and a husband who realizes his carefully constructed double life has just collapsed. When Stacy Feldman's body arrived at the Denver Medical Examiner's office on March 2, 2015, Dr. William Smock conducted what should have been a routine autopsy. He'd performed thousands of these examinations over his career, documenting causes of death with clinical precision. What he found was puzzling. Stacy Feldman was a healthy 44-year-old woman with no significant medical history that would explain sudden death. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, no stab wounds, no broken bones. The external examination revealed some bruising on her extremities and torso, but nothing that immediately screamed homicide. Dr. Smock opened up the body and examined the internal organs. The heart showed some minor abnormalities, nothing particularly alarming. The lungs contained some fluid, but not the massive amounts you'd expect in a typical drowning victim. There was some hemorrhaging in various tissues, small pockets of blood that suggested trauma, but the pattern wasn't clear. Toxicology tests were ordered. Blood and tissue samples were sent to the lab to test for drugs, alcohol, poisons, any substance that might explain the death. The results came back days later, completely clean. No alcohol, no drugs, no toxins. Nothing that would cause sudden death. Dr. Smock faced a dilemma. He couldn't definitively determine how Stacy Feldman died. Could it have been cardiac-related? Possibly, though there wasn't strong evidence. Could it have been a seizure while bathing? Also possible. Could it have been foul play? The bruising was concerning, but not conclusive. On March 4, 2015, Dr. Smock made a decision that would allow a killer to walk free for nearly 3 years. He classified Stacy Feldman's death as undetermined, not natural, not accidental, not suicide, not homicide, undetermined. It's a classification medical examiners use when the evidence doesn't clearly point in any direction. A medical shrug that says, "We don't know what happened here." And in most cases, it's a responsible, appropriate conclusion when faced with ambiguous evidence. But in this case, it meant that Robert Feldman wouldn't be charged with any crime. The investigation, such as it was, stalled. The death certificate listed undetermined as the manner of death. Stacy was buried. Robert collected on her life insurance policy. Life moved on, except it didn't, not for everyone. Susan couldn't shake what had happened. She'd called Stacy that morning to tell her about the affair. By that afternoon, Stacy was dead. The timing was too coincidental, too convenient for Robert, too convenient to be mere accident. She learned about Stacy's death through the news. When she saw Robert's statement to media, presenting himself as a devastated widower, something inside her snapped. This wasn't right. This wasn't justice. Susan reached out to Stacy's family. She told them about the affair, about her phone call to Stacy that morning, about her suspicions that Robert had killed his wife. Stacy's loved ones had already questioned the circumstances of her death. A healthy woman doesn't just die in a bathtub without explanation. But Susan's information added a crucial piece. Motive. Robert Feldman had a reason to want his wife dead. And he'd had the opportunity to kill her just hours after she learned the truth about his double life. Stacy's family hired a private investigator. They pressured the Denver Police Department to take another look at the case. They compiled a dossier of information about Robert's behavior after Stacy's death, his quick return to dating, his lack of visible grief, his suspicious financial transactions. But without new evidence, without a clear cause of death, there was nothing police could do. The case remained closed, the death remained undetermined, and Robert remained free. For 2 years, Stacy's family and Susan advocated for justice. They contacted local media, they hired lawyers, they demanded that someone, anyone, take this case seriously. Finally, in 2017, their persistence paid off. The case landed on the desk of Detective Dave Eberhardt in the Denver Police Department's Cold Case Unit. Detective Dave Eberhardt had joined the Denver Police Department in 1984 and had worked hundreds of homicides over his 33-year career. He'd seen every type of murder imaginable: crimes of passion, premeditated killings, deaths staged to look like accidents or suicides. He'd developed an instinct for cases that didn't smell right. The Stacy Feldman case reeked. Eberhardt started from the beginning, reviewing every piece of evidence from the original investigation. He read Dr. Smock's autopsy report multiple times, noting the bruising, the hemorrhaging, the ambiguous findings that had led to the undetermined classification. He reviewed the scene photographs from the Feldman home, studying the bathroom where Stacy had been found. Then he started digging into Robert Feldman's background. What he discovered was a man living a double life. Robert had profiles on multiple dating websites and apps, not just one or two, but many. He'd been meeting women for years, apparently, each time claiming to be single or separated or going through a divorce. The affair with Susan wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern. But the most important discovery came from Robert's own statements to police in the days after Stacy's death. Eberhardt read through the interview transcripts carefully, noting every detail Robert had provided about his timeline that day. Robert claimed he'd left home with his children around 8:30 a.m. and hadn't returned until 3 p.m. But Eberhardt had something the original investigators hadn't pursued aggressively: cell phone records. He subpoenaed Robert's phone data and examined the cell tower pings, the digital breadcrumbs that modern phones leave as they connect to cellular networks. What those records showed would become crucial evidence. Robert's phone had pinged off towers near his home throughout the morning and early afternoon, times when he claimed to be miles away at the synagogue, at the basketball game, at various locations around Denver. The phone records suggested Robert had been home during the critical hours between Susan's phone call to Stacy and the time Robert claimed to have discovered his wife's body. He'd been home when Stacy learned about his affair. He'd been home during the time window when she died. Robert Feldman had lied about his whereabouts, and that lie suggested consciousness of guilt. Armed with this new information, Detective Eberhardt approached the district attorney's office with a radical proposal: exhume Stacy Feldman's body and conduct a second autopsy. This time, the medical examiner would examine the body with full knowledge of the suspicious circumstances, the timing of the affair revelation, the holes in Robert's timeline. Exhumation is never undertaken lightly. It's expensive, emotionally devastating for families, and risky from a legal standpoint. If the second autopsy doesn't reveal anything new, you've put the family through trauma for nothing and potentially harmed your case. But Eberhardt was convinced. The original autopsy had been conducted without crucial context. Dr. Smock hadn't known about the affair, the confrontation, the motive. He'd examined Stacy's body, looking for obvious causes of death and, finding none, had classified it as undetermined. But what if he'd been looking at a homicide all along and simply hadn't recognized the signs? Stacy's family supported the exhumation without hesitation. They wanted answers. They wanted justice. If this was what it took, they were willing to endure it. On September 26, 2017, 2.5 years after Stacy's death, her casket was removed from the ground. Her body, preserved by embalming and the sealed casket environment, was transported to the medical examiner's office for a second examination. This time, the autopsy would be conducted by Dr. Kelly Lear Cowell, one of Colorado's most experienced forensic pathologists, and this time she would be looking for evidence of homicide. Dr. Kelly Lear Cowell approached Stacy Feldman's body with a different mindset than Dr. Smock had 2 years earlier. She knew the full context, the affair, the confrontation, the suspicious timeline, the husband's lies. She was looking for evidence of foul play, signs that might have been missed or misinterpreted in the first examination. What she found would change everything. Dr. Lear Cowell began with the external examination, documenting every mark, every bruise, every abnormality on Stacy's skin. The bruising that Dr. Smock had noted was still visible, even after 2 years. But where, Dr. Smock had seen random contusions. Dr. Lear Cowell saw a pattern. There was bruising on Stacy's upper arms, the kind of marks consistent with someone being forcefully held or restrained. There was bruising on her chest, suggesting pressure had been applied. Most significantly, there were petechiae, tiny pinpoint hemorrhages, around Stacy's eyes and on the inside of her eyelids. Petechiae are a classic sign of asphyxiation. They occur when blood vessels burst due to increased pressure in the head and neck, often seen in cases of strangulation or suffocation. Dr. Lear Cowell moved to the internal examination. She carefully examined Stacy's airway, looking for signs of obstruction or trauma. She examined the hyoid bone in the neck, which often fractures in strangulation cases. It was intact, but that didn't rule out suffocation. Many suffocation victims show no injury to the neck structures because the killer doesn't apply pressure to the neck itself, but rather covers the nose and mouth. The lungs were next. In a typical drowning, the victim inhales large amounts of water in the final moments of life, desperately gasping for air. The lungs become heavy, waterlogged, filled with fluid. But Stacy's lungs contained only minimal water, far less than you'd expect in a true drowning victim. This was a critical finding. It suggested that Stacy was already dead, or nearly dead, when she entered the water. She hadn't drowned because she couldn't breathe in the water. She'd been unable to breathe before the water ever touched her face. Dr. Leah Cowell documented everything meticulously. She took photographs, collected tissue samples for microscopic examination, reviewed every organ system. After hours of painstaking work, she reached her conclusion. Stacy Feldman had been suffocated. Someone had covered her nose and mouth until she couldn't breathe, until her oxygen-starved brain shut down, until her heart stopped. Then her body had been placed in the bathtub, the tub filled with water, the scene staged to look like an accidental drowning. On October 23, 2017, Dr. Leah Cowell signed an amended death certificate. The manner of death was no longer undetermined. It was now officially homicide. On February 13, 2018, nearly 3 years after Stacy's death, detectives knocked on Robert Feldman's door. He was taken into custody without incident and charged with first-degree murder. The charge carried a potential sentence of life in prison without parole. Robert maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest. He told anyone who would listen that this was a rush to judgment, a miscarriage of justice, a case built on speculation rather than solid evidence. His defense team immediately began preparing for trial, knowing they faced an uphill battle. The evidence was circumstantial, no eyewitnesses, no confession, no murder weapon. But it was compelling circumstantial evidence, the kind that wins convictions when properly presented to a jury. The legal proceedings moved slowly, as they often do in complex murder cases. Robert's attorneys filed numerous motions challenging the evidence, seeking to suppress the cell phone records, questioning the validity of the second autopsy, arguing that the case should never go to trial. Each motion was argued, briefed, and decided by the judge. Most were denied, but the process took time. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, which shut down courts nationwide and delayed trials for months or even years. Robert remained in custody, unable to post the substantial bond set by the court. His children, now teenagers, were being raised by family members. The community that had once viewed the Feldmans as an ideal family now knew them as the center of a sensational murder case. Finally, in April 2022, more than 7 years after Stacy's death, the trial began. The Denver District Court courtroom filled with spectators, media, and Stacy's family members as jury selection began. Prosecutor Lisa Porch led the state's team, while defense attorney David Kaplan represented Robert Feldman. They spent days questioning potential jurors, looking for people who could set aside any preconceived notions and decide the case based solely on the evidence presented. A jury of 12 was finally seated, along with several alternates. On April 20th, 2022, opening statements began. Pouch stood before the jury and laid out the prosecution's theory in stark terms. This is a case about a man who was living a double life, a man whose lies caught up with him, and a man who chose murder over the consequences of his actions. She walked the jury through the timeline, starting with Susan's phone call to Stacy on the morning of March 1st. She explained how Robert had returned home to find an angry, betrayed wife who now knew the truth about his infidelity. She described the confrontation that must have occurred, the argument that escalated into violence. Robert Feldman suffocated his wife, Pouch told the jury. He held his hand over her nose and mouth until she couldn't breathe, until she lost consciousness, until she died. Then he staged the scene to make it look like she'd accidentally drowned in the bathtub, and he almost got away with it. The defense's opening was predictably different. Kaplan acknowledged that Robert had been unfaithful, that he'd lied about his relationship status, that he'd behaved badly. But infidelity isn't murder, he argued. The prosecution wants you to believe that because Robert Feldman had an affair, he must have killed his wife, Kaplan told the jury. But that's not evidence. That's suspicion. That's conjecture. The state's entire case is built on speculation and circumstantial evidence. They cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Robert Feldman murdered anyone. Kaplan previewed his defense strategy, attacking the medical evidence, questioning the reliability of the cell phone records, and providing alternative explanations for Stacy's death. It was reasonable doubt, he argued, and that should be enough for acquittal. The prosecution's first major witness was Susan, the woman whose phone call had set everything in motion. She took the stand nervously, aware that all eyes in the courtroom were on her. Under Pouch's questioning, Susan described meeting Robert online, their relationship, and his repeated lies about being separated or divorcing. She explained her decision to search for information about Robert's wife on the morning of March 1st. "What did you find when you searched?" Pouch asked. "That he was lying about everything," Susan replied. "He was married, very much married. There was no divorce, no separation. His wife had no idea about me." Susan described making the decision to call Stacy, finding her phone number, and making that fateful call around 9 a.m. "And what did you tell her?" Pouch asked. "Everything. About the affair, about how long it had been going on, about Robert's lies. I felt she deserved to know the truth." "How did she respond?" "She was calm, surprisingly calm. She asked a few questions about where we'd met, how many times we'd been together. She thanked me for calling. Then she hung up." Susan's voice broke as she continued. "A few hours later, I learned she was dead. I immediately knew something was wrong. The timing was too convenient for Robert." Under cross-examination, Kaplan tried to undermine Susan's credibility. Wasn't she just a scorned mistress seeking revenge? Hadn't she been angry when she learned Robert was still married? Couldn't this all be about trying to hurt Robert? But Susan held firm. She had nothing to gain from testifying. She'd come forward because she believed it was the right thing to do, because a woman had died hours after learning information Susan had provided. The jury watched intently, weighing her testimony, judging her credibility. Detective Eberhardt took the stand next, walking the jury through his investigation. He explained how he'd reopened the case in 2017, what had initially drawn his suspicion, and how he'd built the case against Robert Feldman. The most crucial part of his testimony centered on the cell phone records. Eberhardt had brought in an expert witness, a telecommunications specialist, who explained how cell towers work and how phone records can be used to approximate a device's location. The expert displayed maps showing the location of various cell towers in Denver and the towers that Robert's phone had pinged on March 1st, 2015. According to Robert's statement to police, he should have been miles away from his home between 8:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. But the cell tower data showed his phone connecting to towers near his residence throughout that time period. These records indicate that Mr. Feldman's phone was in the vicinity of his home during the hours he claimed to be elsewhere, the expert testified. And the pattern of tower connections is inconsistent with his stated itinerary. This was damning evidence, but it wasn't perfect. Under cross-examination, the defense's own telecommunications expert argued that cell tower data isn't precise enough to pinpoint exact locations. A phone could ping off a tower from miles away. The data could be misinterpreted. Robert could have been where he said he was, and the towers might still have registered his phone. The jury would have to decide which expert to believe. Dr. Kelly Lear-Cowell's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. For hours, she walked the jury through her findings from the second autopsy, using photographs, diagrams, and medical terminology explained in layman's terms. She pointed out the petechial hemorrhages around Stacy's eyes. "These are classic indicators of asphyxiation," she explained. "They occur when blood vessels burst due to increased pressure in the head, which happens when someone can't breathe." She discussed the minimal water in Stacy's lungs. "In a typical drowning, we see the lungs filled with water. The victim inhales desperately as they're dying, but misses Feldman's lungs contained very little water, suggesting she was already dead or nearly dead when she entered the water. She described the bruising pattern on Stacy's body. The bruises on her upper arms are consistent with restraint. The bruising on her chest suggests pressure was applied. Together, these findings paint a picture of a struggle, of someone being forcibly held. Dr. Leah Cowell, Pouch asked, based on your examination and your expert opinion, how did Stacy Feldman die? She was suffocated, Dr. Leah Cowell replied without hesitation. Someone covered her nose and mouth, preventing her from breathing. She died of asphyxiation. The drowning was staged after death. The defense's cross-examination was aggressive. Kaplan brought Dr. Smock, the original pathologist, back to testify. Dr. Smock stood by his initial findings. The evidence had been ambiguous, the cause of death uncertain. He suggested that Dr. Leah Cowell had gone into the second autopsy with bias, looking for evidence of murder, because that's what investigators suspected. Couldn't these findings be interpreted differently? Kaplan asked Dr. Smock. Or couldn't the bruising be from CPR attempts or from moving the body? Couldn't the petechiae have other causes? Couldn't this still have been a natural death or an accident? It's possible, Dr. Smock conceded. The evidence is open to interpretation. The prosecution called a parade of witnesses to testify about Robert's behavior before and after Stacy's death. Friends testified that Robert had seemed distant in the months before Stacy died, that he'd been distracted, that he'd been spending unusual amounts of time away from home. Stacy's friends took the stand, several fighting back tears. They described Stacy's suspicions about Robert in the weeks before her death. She'd found credit card charges she couldn't explain. She'd questioned Robert about late nights at work. She'd confided to one friend that she thought Robert might be having an affair. Did she say what she planned to do about it? Pouch asked. She said she was going to confront him, the friend replied. She said she deserved the truth. One particularly damaging witness was a woman Robert had dated briefly a few months after Stacy's death. She testified that Robert had seemed unemotional when discussing his wife's death, referring to it matter-of-factly without any visible sadness. Did he ever express guilt or remorse about her death? Pouch asked. No, the woman replied. He talked about it like it was just an unfortunate thing that had happened, like a car accident or something. There was no emotion. The defense didn't have many options. They couldn't put Robert on the stand. He would have been eviscerated under cross-examination about his affairs, his lies, his inconsistent statements to police. So they focused on attacking the prosecution's evidence and providing alternative explanations. They called their own medical expert, who testified that Stacy could have died from any number of natural causes: a heart arrhythmia, a seizure, a stroke. Any of these could have caused her to lose consciousness in the bathtub and drown. The bruising could have occurred from falling, from CPR attempts, from the body being moved. They presented witnesses who testified that Robert seemed genuinely shocked and devastated when Stacy died. They argued that his later behavior, dating again, moving on with his life, was simply how he coped with grief, not evidence of guilt. They hammered away at the weakness of the circumstantial evidence. Where was the physical evidence placing Robert's hands on Stacy? Where was the forensic evidence of a struggle? Where was the proof, beyond speculation, that Robert had killed his wife? Lisa Pouch stood for the prosecution's final argument. She'd spent weeks presenting evidence, calling witnesses, building her case. Now it all came down to this, convincing 12 people that Robert Feldman had murdered his wife. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, let's talk about reasonable doubt. The defense wants you to believe that all of these things, the affair, the phone call, the confrontation, the death, the staged scene, the lies, the inconsistencies, are just an incredible series of coincidences. They want you to believe that Stacy Feldman happened to die of natural causes on the very same morning she learned about her husband's affair, just hours after confronting him, and that it's mere chance that her death was so convenient for Robert. She walked the jury through the evidence methodically. The phone call from Susan establishing that Stacy knew about the affair, the cell phone records proving Robert was home when he said he was elsewhere, the medical evidence showing asphyxiation, not drowning, the behavioral evidence showing a man without remorse. Dr. Leah Cowell told you how Stacy died. She was suffocated. The defense wants you to ignore that expert opinion because it's inconvenient for them. They want you to believe Dr. Smock's original undetermined finding, but Dr. Smock didn't have all the information. He didn't know about the affair, the confrontation, the motive. She concluded by reminding the jury of their duty. You heard the evidence. You know what happened in that house on March 1st, 2015. Stacy Feldman deserves justice. Find Robert Feldman guilty of murder. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They requested transcripts of testimony. They asked to review the cell phone records. They wanted to see the autopsy photographs again. They sent questions to the judge about the definition of reasonable doubt. The deliberation room was tense. Some jurors were immediately convinced of Robert's guilt. The evidence seemed overwhelming to them. Others had doubts. Was the medical evidence really that clear? Could the cell phone data be trusted? Was it possible that this really was just a tragic series of coincidences? But as they worked through the evidence piece by piece, a consensus began to form. Individually, each piece of evidence might be questioned, but taken together, they formed a picture: the affair, the confrontation, the lies about whereabouts, the staged scene, the lack of remorse. On April 27, 2022, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Stacy's family sat in the front row, holding hands, barely breathing. Robert Feldman stood at the defense table, his face a mask. The judge called the court to order. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Feldman, guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom exploded with emotion. Stacy's family collapsed in tears of relief and grief. Robert Feldman showed no reaction, standing stoic as his attorneys conferred with him in hushed tones. In the gallery, reporters rushed to file their breaking news. The judge thanked the jury for their service and set a sentencing date. Robert Feldman was immediately remanded into custody. As deputies led him away in handcuffs, he glanced back once at the courtroom, then disappeared through the door that would lead him to prison for the rest of his life. After 7 years, 2 autopsies, thousands of investigative hours, and one of the most complex circumstantial cases in Colorado history, justice had been served.